Hello, welcome back to A Story for You. We are reading some more Dr. Seuss this morning, because it's morning where I am. We are reading a story called, let me find the picture, The 500 Hats of Bartholomew Cubbins. Now, I'm reading from this book. And here's what your parents might be interested in. This story was first written and published in 1938. So that's about 80 plus years ago. So that was a long time, but it's still fun for today. Excuse me. In the beginning, Bartholomew Cubbins didn't have 500 hats. He had only one hat. It was an old one that had belonged to his father and his father's father before him. It was probably the oldest and plainest hat in the whole kingdom of Did, where Bartholomew Cubbins lived. But Bartholomew liked it, especially because of the feather that always pointed straight up in the air. See the hat? No, baby. We're fighting off kitties today. The kingdom of Did was ruled by King Derwin. His palace stood high on the top of the mountain. From his balcony, he looked down over the houses of all his subjects. First, over the spires of the noblemen's castles, across the broad roofs of the rich men's mansions, then over the little houses of the townsfolk to the huts and farmers far off in the fields. It was a mighty view, and it made King Derwin feel mighty important. Far off in the fields on the edge of the cranberry bog stood the hut of the Cubbins family. From the small door, Bartholomew looked across the huts of the farmers and the houses of the townsfolk, and then to the rich men's mansions and the noblemen's castles, up to the great towering palace of the king. It was exactly the same view the King Derwin saw from his balcony, but Bartholomew saw it backward. It was a mighty view, and it made Bartholomew Cubbins feel small. There's Bartholomew looking at the palace of the king. Just after sunrise, one Saturday morning, Bartholomew started for town. He felt very happy. A pleasant breeze whistled through the feather of his hat, and in his right hand he carried a basket of cranberries to sell at the market. He was anxious to sell them quickly and bring the money back home to his parents. He walked faster and faster till he got to the gates of the town. The sound of the silver trumpets rang out in the air. Hoofbeats clattered on the streets. Clear the way! Clear the way! Make way for the king! There's Bartholomew Cubbins walking along. And there they are, calling to clear the way. All of the people rushed for the sidewalks, and they drove their carts right down the curbstones, and Bartholomew clutched the basket tighter, and around the corner dashed 50 trumpeters on yellow-robed horses, and behind them on crimson-robed horses rode the king's own guard. "Hats off to the king!" shouted the captain of the king's own guards. On came the king's carriage, white and gold and purple, and it rumbled like thunder through the narrow street, and it swept past Bartholomew. Then suddenly its mighty brakes shrieked, and it lurched, and then it stopped. The whole procession stood still. Bartholomew could hardly believe what he saw. Through the side window of the carriage, the king himself was staring back, straight back at him. Bartholomew began to tremble. "Back up," the king commanded the royal coachman. The royal coachman shouted to the royal horses. The king's own guard shouted to the crimson-robed horses. The trumpeters shouted to the yellow-robed horses. Very slowly, the whole procession backed down the street until the king's carriage stopped right in front of Bartholomew. The king leaned from his carriage window and fixed his eyes directly on Bartholomew Cubbins. "Well? Well?" he demanded. Bartholomew shook with fright. "I ought to say something," he thought to himself, but he could think of nothing to say. "Well?" demanded the king again. "Do you or do you not take your hat off before the king?" "Yes, indeed, sir," answered Bartholomew, feeling greatly relieved. "I do take my hat off before my king." "Then take it off this very instant," commanded the king more loudly than ever. "But, sire, my hat is off," answered Bartholomew. "Such impudence!" shouted the king, shaking an angry finger. "How dare you stand there and tell me that it's off?" I don't like to say that you're wrong, sire," said Bartholomew very politely, "but as you see, my hat is off." And he showed the king the hat in his hand. "If that's your hat in your hand," demanded the king, "what's that on your head?" On my head?" gasped Bartholomew. There did seem to be something on his head, and he reached up with his hand and touched a hat. There they are. The face of Bartholomew Cubbins turned very red. "It's a hat, sire," he stammered, "but it can't be mine. Someone behind me must have put it on my head." "I don't care how it got there," said the king. "You take it off." And the king sat back in his carriage. Bartholomew quickly snatched off the hat. He stared at it in astonishment. It was exactly the same as his own hat. Same size, same color, the same exact feather. "By the crown of the fathers," roared the king again, leaning out the window, "did I or did I not command you to take off your hat?" "You did, sire. I took it off. I took it off twice." "Nonsense. There is a hat upon your head." "Another hat?" Again Bartholomew reached up with his hand and touched a hat. Come, what is the meaning of all this?" demanded the king, his face purple with rage. "I don't know, sire," answered Bartholomew. "It never happened to me before." The king was now shaking with such fury that the carriage rocked on its wheels and the royal coachman could hardly sit in his seat. "Arrest this impudent trickster!" shouted the king of the captain of the own guard. "We'll teach him to take off his hat." Here's poor Bartholomew. Let me see. Make sure you can see. With two hats and one on his head. The royal coachman cracked his long whip, and the king's carriage swung forward up the street toward the palace. But the king and the captain of the king's own guard leaned down from his big brass saddle and grabbed Bartholomew Cubbins by his shirt. Away flew Bartholomew's basket. The cranberries bounced all over the cobblestones and rolled down into the gutter. With a jangle of spurs and a clatter of horseshoes, the captain and Bartholomew sped up the winding street toward the palace. Out of the narrow streets, up on the hill, Bartholomew clung to the captain's broad back. On and on they galloped, past the bright gardens of the wealthy merchants, higher and higher up the mountain, on past the walls of the nobleman's castle. Kitten. No, baby, no. Flop! The wind started whisking off Bartholomew's hat. Flop, flop! 2 more flew off. Flop, flop, flop! Flew another and another. 4, 5, 6, 7. Bartholomew kept counting as the hats came faster and faster. Lords and ladies stared from the windows of their turrets, wondering what the strange stream of hats could mean. Over the palace drawbridge they sped, through the great gates, and into the courtyard, and the captain pulled in his reins. "His Majesty waits in the throne room," said a guard, saluting the captain. "The throne room!" The captain dropped Bartholomew to his ground. "I'd certainly hate to be in your shoes," he said, shaking his head sadly. For a moment Bartholomew was terribly frightened. Still, he thought to himself, the king can do nothing dreadful to punish me because I really haven't done anything wrong. It would be cowardly to feel afraid. Bartholomew threw back his shoulders and marched straight ahead into the palace. "Follow the black carpet," said the guard at the door. All through the long hallway, Bartholomew could hear the muttered voices behind heavy doors. "He won't take off his hat? No, he won't take off his hat." There they go. See how you see it? Okay. Oop. I gotta move my fingers sometimes. There you go. Bartholomew walked on till he stood in the very middle of the throne room. The king, in his long scarlet robe, was sitting on his throne, and beside him stood Sir Alaric, keeper of the king's records. He wore his belt instead of a sword, and a long silver rule. Lords and noblemen of the court stood solemn and silent. The king looked down at Bartholomew severely. "Young man, I give you one more chance. Will you take your hat off for your king?" "Your Majesty," said Bartholomew as politely as he possibly could, "I will, but I'm afraid it won't do any good." And he took off his hat, and it didn't do any good. Another hat was on Bartholomew's head, and he took off hat after hat after hat until he was standing in a great pile of hats. The lords and ladies were so astonished that they couldn't even speak. Such a thing had never happened in the throne room before. Trying to... Woo! Can you see? There you go. All right. Heavens! Said Sir Alaric, keeper of the records, blinking behind his triangular spectacles. "He's taken off 45. "And there were 3 in the town," said the king. "And you must add on the 87 that blew off my head as we galloped up the hill," said Bartholomew, trying to be helpful. 135 hats! Most unusual," said Sir Alaric, writing it down on a long scroll. Come, said the king impatiently. "Sir Alaric, what do you make of all this nonsense?" "Very serious, your Majesty," answered Sir Alaric. "I advise you to call in the expert on hats." "Excellent," agreed the king. "Ho, guard! Fetch in Sir Snips, maker of the hats for all the fine lords." And into the throne room marched the smallest man wearing the tallest hat that Bartholomew had ever seen. It was Sir Snips. Instead of a sword, he wore at his side a large pair of scissors. "Take a look at this boy's hat," commanded the king. Sir Snipes looked at Bartholomew Cubbins' hat and sniffed in disgust. Then he turned to the king and bowed stiffly.
Your Majesty, I, Sir Snips, am the maker of hats for all the fine lords, and I make hats of cloth of gold, and fine silks, and gems, and ostrich plumes. You ask me what I think of this hat? Pooh! It is the most ordinary hat that I have ever laid eyes on. In that case, said the king, it should be very simple for you to take it off. Simple indeed, mumbled Sir Snips haughtily, and standing on his tiptoes, he pushed his pudgy thumb at Bartholomew's hat and knocked it off his head. Immediately, another hat appeared on Bartholomew's head. And here is Sir Alaric writing things down. And here is Sir Snips with his silly big hat. Screebies! Screamed Sir Snips, leaping in the air higher than he was tall, and he turned and ran shrieking out of the throne room. Dear me, said the king, looking very puzzled. If Snips can't do it, this must be more than an ordinary hat. 136, wrote Sir Alaric, wrinkling his brow. Your Majesty, I advise that you call in your wise men. A fine idea, said the king. Oh, guard, bring me Nad. Nad knows everything about everything in my kingdom. And there came in an old man, and he looked at the hat on Bartholomew's head, and he looked at the pile of hats on the floor. Nad, my wise man, can you take off his hat? Asked the king, and Nad shook his head solemnly, no. Then fetch me the father of Nad, commanded the king. He knows about everything in my whole kingdom and in the world beyond. And in came an even older man. But when he looked at Bartholomew's hats, the father of Nad merely locked his fingers across his beard and said nothing. There is Sir Snips running from the throne room. And there is Nad and the father of Nad. Then bring me the father of Nad, ordered the king. He knows everything in all my kingdom, in all the world beyond, and in all the other worlds that could possibly happen to be. Then the oldest man of them all came. But he just looked at Bartholomew and nibbled nervously at the end of his beard. Does this mean that there's no one in my whole kingdom who can take off this boy's hat? Bellowed the king in a terrifying voice. A small voice came up through the balcony window. What's the matter, Uncle Derwin? To Bartholomew, it sounded like the voice of a boy. The king stepped out over the balcony and leaned over the marble railing. There's a boy in here about your age, the king said, and he won't take off his hat. Bartholomew tiptoed up behind the king and looked down, and there stood a boy with a big lace collar, and a very proud little boy, and his nose was in the air. It was the Grand Duke Wilfred, nephew of the king. You send him down here, the Grand Nephew said. I'll fix him. And the king thought for a minute, and he pushed back his crown, and he scratched his head. Well, maybe you can. There's no harm trying. Take him to Grand Duke Wilfred, commanded the king, and two of the king's own guards led Bartholomew out of the throne room. There is the father of Nad, and there is the Grand Duke Wilfred. Pooh, said the Grand Duke Wilfred, looking at Bartholomew's hat and laughing meaningly. That hat won't come off? You stand over there. He pointed to a corner of the curved wall. I need a little target practice with my bow and arrow. Then Bartholomew saw that the Grand Duke Wilfred had only a child's bow, and he didn't feel frightened. He spoke up proudly. I can shoot with my father's big bow. My bow's plenty big enough for shooting hats, especially hats like yours, answered Wilfred, and he let the arrow fly. Zzz! And it grazed Bartholomew's forehead and nipped off his hat. Away it blew over the parapet, but another hat appeared on his head. Zzz! 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 The arrows flew, till the Grand Duke's whole bag full of arrows was gone, and still a hat was upon Bartholomew's head. It's not fair, said the Grand Duke. It's not fair. He threw down his bow and stamped upon it. 145 hats, gulped Sir Alaric. And there, let's see. There we go. There go all the hats. These hats are driving me mad. The king's voice ran out through the palace. Why waste time with a child's bow and arrow? Fetch me the mightiest bow and arrow in all my realm, and fetch me Yeoman the Bowman. Yeoman of the Bowman, echoed all the lords and noblemen of the court. A gigantic man strode across his terrace, and his bow was as big as the branch of a tree, and his arrow twice as long as Bartholomew, and thicker than his wrist. Yeoman of the Bowman, said the king, shoot off this boy's hat and make it stay off. Bartholomew was trembling so hard that he could scarcely stand straight. The yeoman bent back his mighty bow. Grzib! Like a mad giant hornet, the arrow flew through the air towards Bartholomew Cubbins. Grzap! The arrow flew. The arrowhead shot through his hat and carried it off for a full half-mile. Zop! It plopped to the stop in the heart of an oak tree, and there was Bartholomew's hat with another hat on his head, and the face of Yeoman the Bowman went white as the palace walls. It's black magic, he shrieked. There is the big Yeoman of the Bowman. Oh, and the hat. Black magic! That's just what it is, sighed the king with relief. I should have thought of that before. That makes things simple. Back to the throne room. Call my magicians. In the throne room, there wasn't a sound as loud as a breath, but from the spiral stairs and down through the southwest tower came the shuffling of slow, padding feet. The magicians were coming, low and slow. They were chanting words that were strange. Dig a hole 5 furrows long, down to where the night snakes creep, mix and mold the mystic mud, marber, barber, titter, tud. In came 7 black-gowned magicians, and beside each one stalked a lean black cat. They circled around Bartholomew Cubbins, muttering deep and mysterious words. Stop this useless muttering, ordered the king. I want a chant that will charm away the boy's hat. And the magicians huddled over Bartholomew and chanted, Winkabus, Tinkabus, Fotichi, Clay, hat on this demon's head, fly far away. Howl, men, howl away, howl away, howl away. Yowl, cats, yowl away, yowl away, yowl away. Hat on this demon's head, seep away, creep away, leap away, never come back. There are the silly magicians. A mighty good chant, the king said, looking very pleased. Are you sure it will work? All the magicians nodded together. But, the king said, looking puzzled, there still seems to be a hat on his head. How long will it take for the charm to work? Be calm, O sire, and have no fears, chanted the magicians. Our charm will work in 10 short years. 10 years? Gasped the king. Away, fools, he shouted. Out of my sight. I can't wait 10 years to get rid of this hat. Oh dear, what can I do? What can I do? If I were the king, whispered the Grand Duke Wilfred, I'd chop off his head. A dreadful thought, said the king, biting his lip, but I'm afraid I'll have to do it. Young man, he said to Bartholomew Cubbins, and pointed to the small door at the end of the room, march down those stairs to the dungeon and tell the executioner to chop off your head. Bartholomew's heart sank into his boots, and he did as the king commanded. I must take off my hat, he said to himself as he started down the long black stairway. This is my last chance. One after another he tore from his head. 156, 157. It grew colder and damper. 217, 218, 219. Down, down, down. 231, 232, 233. It seemed to Bartholomew that they must be in the very heart of the mountain. Who's there? A voice came from the blackness. Bartholomew turned a corner and stepped into the dungeon. The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe idly because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. The king says you must chop off my head, said Bartholomew. Oh, I'd hate to. The executioner looked at him with a friendly smile. You seem like such a nice boy. Well, the king says you have to, said Bartholomew, so please get it over with. All right, sighed the executioner, but first you've got to take off your hat. Why? Said Bartholomew. I don't know, said the executioner, but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anyone with this hat on. All right, said Bartholomew, you take it off for me. The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. What's this? He gasped, blinking through the holes of his mask as another hat was on Bartholomew's head. He flipped off this one, then another and another. Fiddlesticks, grunted the executioner, throwing his axe on the floor. I can't execute you at all. And he shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. I'm going to show you this picture early because it's just too cute. The king had been taking a nap on his throne. What are you doing back here? He said to Bartholomew, angry at being awakened. I'm sorry, Your Majesty, explained Bartholomew. My hat can't come off. Oh, my head can't come off with my hat on. It's against the rules. So it can't, said the king, leaning back wearily. How many hats does that make altogether? The executioner knocked off 13, and I counted. Oh, and I left 178 more on the dungeon steps, answered Bartholomew. 346 hats, mumbled Sir Alaric from behind his scroll. Uncle Derwin, yawned the Grand Duke Wilfred. I suppose I'll have to do away with him. Send him up to the highest turret, and I, in person, will push him off. Wilfred, I'm surprised at you, said the king, but I guess it's a good idea. So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins up the highest turret up and up and up the turret stairs, and he climbed behind them. "This is my very last chance," thought Bartholomew, and he snatched off his hat. 347, and he snatched off another, and he pulled and tore and flung them from behind him. 398, 399, and his arms ached from pulling off hats. But still his hats came off, and Bartholomew climbed on. 448, 449, 450, counted Sir Alaric, puffing up from the stairs behind. Suddenly, Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangular spectacles. He wiped them on his sleeves. And then he looked again. The hats began to change. Hat 451 had not one but 2 feathers on it. Hat 252 had 3. And 452 had 3. 453 also had 3 and a little red jewel. And each new hat was fancier than the one before. "Your Majesty! Your Majesty!" cried out Sir Alaric. But the King and the Grand Duke were way up and they couldn't hear. And they had already reached the top of the highest turret, and Bartholomew was following just behind. "Step right out here and get on that wall," snapped the Grand Duke Wilfrid. "I can't wait to push you off." And there's Sir Alaric counting hats. All right, now ready? Let's watch them get fancier. Oh, look at that. But when Bartholomew stepped up on the wall, they gasped in amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat that had ever been seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a large ruby, larger than the king himself even owned. And it had ostrich plumes and a cockatoo plume and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. And besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. And the Grand Duke Wilfrid took a step forward, and Bartholomew thought that at last his end had come. "Wait!" shouted the king, and he could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. "I won't wait!" The Grand Duke talked back to the king. "I'm going to push him off now. That big new hat makes me madder than ever." And he flung out his arms to push Bartholomew off. But the king was quicker than Wilfrid, and he grabbed him by the back of his fine lace collar. "This is to teach you," His Majesty said sternly, "that Grand Dukes never talk back to the king." And he turned the Grand Duke Wilfrid over his knee and spanked him soundly right on the seat of his royal little silk pants. "And now," smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew's hat down from the wall, "it would be nice if you would sell me that wonderful hat." 498, 499, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alaric, who had just arrived at the top of the steps. "And that," he pointed to the hat on Bartholomew's head, "makes exactly 500. 500! exclaimed the king. "Will you sell it to me for 500 pieces of gold?" "Anything you say, sire," answered Bartholomew. "You see, I've never sold one before." The king's hands trembled with joy as he reached for the hat. Slowly, Bartholomew lifted the weight of the great hat from his head, and he held his breath, and suddenly he felt the cool evening breezes blow through his hair. His face broke into a happy smile. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. "Look, Your Majesty, look!" he shouted to the king.
There's mean old Grand Duke.
No, you look at me, answered the king, and he put the great hat on right over his crown. Arm in arm, the king and Bartholomew went down to the counting room and counted out the gold, and then the king sent Bartholomew home to his parents. No basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but 500 gold pieces in a bag. And the king commanded that the hat be bought, and all the other hats too, and be kept forever in the great crystal case by the side of the throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins, nor King Darwin himself, nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did could ever explain how the strange thing had happened. They only could say that it just happened to happen, and it was not likely to happen again. And that is the end. And there is the dear king with the beautiful hat. And sweet, happy Bartholomew Cubbins home to take care of his family. Now, here's up for fun. See if you and your parents can figure out what is different about this story by Dr. Seuss. And they can go on the parent video and comment to me and see if you can figure it out. Thanks for joining me. That's all for our story today. Be sure to let your parents know to like and subscribe. And if you have any comments that you want to talk to me about the story, or questions that you have, or information that you have, you can tell your parents and they can put it in the comments. And then if they set up their phone or their computer, when they subscribe, then they can click on the bell, and that'll tell you every time I put a new video up. I enjoy getting this time with you. Bye-bye.